You tell me he's a sober guy.
Absolutely.
Now, how do you get to that?
Well, when you look at the crash statistics, the vast majority of crashes or collisions are with sober drivers. We hear on TV and in the media all the time about the carnage on our highways by drunk drivers. And yes, drunk drivers do kill people occasionally on the roadways, and they make the newspaper every time there is one. But how many other collisions are there that are fatalities? And we've seen them recently in Savannah. The I-95 crashes, I think we've had 2 or 3 on I-95 that have taken out people. They were sober. We've had the Swedish gentleman killed in a crosswalk in Savannah. That driver was sober. We've had the Georgia Southern student that was just sentenced to 4 years. He was sober, killed 3 of his classmates. They're all sober. So we aren't doing much about sober drivers who kill vastly more people than do drunk drivers. So we're hammering the drunk drivers, and we should, but we're not doing much to prevent the sober drivers from excessive speeding. Okay, we've passed the super speeder law. I think that will prove to be a big disappointment. But we're not getting at the root cause of many of the crashes, which is just operator error.
And a lot of it, I think, is especially in 95, is sleep deprivation.
That can be.
I mean, you see people that, you know, they're going to leave New York in the morning and go to Miami by the afternoon, and it's a 17-hour drive.
That's true. And sleep deprivation can mimic in many ways the same symptoms you have with drunk driving.
And by the time they get to Savannah, you know, there's that strip between Georgia and the beginning in South Carolina, Hardyville, right there, where there's not a tree with bark on it, didn't look like.
That's true. So when we talk about vehicular homicide, it's a difference between whether it's a misdemeanor and a felony. Felony would be if you're driving under the influence or racing or reckless driving. Those would be felonies punishable by up to 15 years in prison.
Or what's the most common form of sober driver accident?
Failure to yield and speeding and rear-ending accidents, but those usually the rear-ending accidents are not fatal. But the ones that are, somebody falls asleep and crosses the center line. But I think the most common are simply failing to yield, maybe turning left and misjudging the distance. But what happens then to somebody who's committed a simple moving violation like running a red light, and I guess I shouldn't leave the red light runners out, that's a major cause of fatalities. What kind of punishment are they facing?
Well, I mean, the drunk drivers, you expect to see the pitchforks and the torches and storming the castle over those guys. But the people who are sober and fell asleep or didn't pay attention, what kind of punishment do they get?
For a misdemeanor vehicle homicide, which is just any other moving violation except DUI, reckless, and so forth, those biggies, that's 12 months maximum punishment. 12 months. And usually those cases, they are, quote, accident cases because somebody ran a red light or ran a stop sign. So the worst they're looking at is 12 months probation.
Versus if they had been drinking?
Then they're looking at 15 years. Or if they're racing or reckless driving. But for the case with the Swedish gentleman, they said they weren't issuing tickets immediately. They were going to investigate it. Well, we have a thing in the law called res ipsa loquitur, Latin for the thing speaks for itself. It came from a case in the early 1900s where in New York they were moving a piano from like the 3rd floor and they had it hoisted out over the sidewalk and the thing fell and killed somebody on the sidewalk. Well, the thing speaks for itself. Somebody was negligent or else it wouldn't have happened. And I kind of think the same thing with if you run down 30 people in a crosswalk, somebody's not paying attention to one's driving. Maybe they're texting or eating soup behind the wheel or something of that nature, but they're not paying attention. And as a minimum, it would seem to me, that would be a case of what we call failure to exercise due care. Everybody has a duty to exercise due care while driving.
Well, what makes the difference between it being a misdemeanor and a felony? I mean, is it just if the judge got up on the wrong side of the bed that day?
No, it is the offense itself that caused the death, the proximate cause of the death. So if it's a red light, the proximate cause of that death was running the red light or failing to yield. If, on the other hand, it's reckless driving or DUI, proximate cause is that more serious offense. And the statute simply says if it's one of those biggies, it is a felony. If it's just a minor traffic violation, like a stop sign or red light violation, by definition, that is a misdemeanor offense.
And what about, we have lots of older drivers now, and no offense to anybody out there who's an older driver. I hope to be one day. But, there was a case 4 years ago in is Malibu or where the guy went driving down the middle of the outdoor shopping center and killed like 12, 14 people.
And I think there was one in Miami Beach, Florida, too. Yeah, those are just misdemeanors. Now, in theory, if you kill 14 people, you could get 14 12-month sentences stacked consecutively. But when somebody does get to be up in years, and if a judge or a police officer detects that there is a problem with that person's ability, they can order an evaluation and get them retested.
Well, do you think it's time for the state DMV to start? I mean, right now you don't even take a test if you have no tickets. You think there's a point where you need to be tested just as a virtue of your age?
I would suggest, if I were king for a day, that I would have a mandatory driver education program maybe once every 5 years. Take a defensive driving course. We get rusty on our skills. We have Joshua's Law passed in 2005 that makes young drivers who are 16 years of age, if they're going to get a license, they have to take now driver education, a 30-hour class with 6 hours added on for night driving. So that's mandatory if you want a license at age 16. But that could benefit other people too.
Yeah. I'm a big proponent of performance driving schools for teenagers. If you stick them out there and teach them the difference, they're not going to want to do it on the street.
Well, I suppose that's true. I have seen a lot of skilled motorcycle riders who like to do wheelies, and the police just seeing a wheelie thinks that's reckless driving. Well, it shows a lot of skill to me. They can keep that sucker up. So it's not necessarily reckless unless they're doing it in heavy traffic or something. They're really just hazarding themselves.
Right. And you've had lots of experience with those cases.
I have.
Because you told me one time about a service guy who was doing wheelies in a parking lot and got a ticket for reckless driving.
He did. And not to minimize the seriousness of what we're talking about, I had a case recently where it was a GI who was going too fast, went over the center line, and there was some belief by some witnesses that he was racing another vehicle. He flatly denied it, but he wound up getting, thank God, straight probation for that offense. We entered a plea, and that's what the result was, but 4 years probation.
Pays to have Doug Andrews as your attorney.
Sometimes.
Okay, we'll be back to tell you how you might be getting ripped off with your water bill right after this. Stay